A Navy SEAL lay broken in the freezing Montana dark, beaten and left for dead beside Crow Lake. His fading spirit slipped toward the silence, his secret dying with him, until a K9 dog froze on an empty road and refused to move. That dog dragged an FBI agent into the night, to a dying stranger guarding a truth that would burn down her whole world. What he protected would destroy everything she loved. If you believe God still sends help in the darkest hour, leave amen. The highway into Larkspur unspooled like a silver ribbon beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the world whole. It was the kind of Montana morning that poets tried and failed to capture. Crow Lake lay to the east, a sheet of hammered blue glass cradled between shoulders of dark pine, and the September light fell golden and unhurried across the valley, as if the land itself had decided there was no reason to rush. Maren Voss rolled her window down 2 inches and let the cold air bite at her cheek. It smelled of cut hay, of wood smoke, of something green and clean that the city had scrubbed out of her years ago. Maren was 29, though the past 18 months had pressed a quiet weight into the corners of her eyes that made strangers guess older. She was tall and lean in the way of someone who ran not for vanity, but to outpace her own thoughts. With ash-blonde hair she kept pulled back so severely it might have looked unkind on another face. Her features were sharp, deliberate, Nordic in their angles, a straight nose, a jaw that set hard when she was thinking, pale gray eyes that missed nothing and forgave little, least of all in herself. She wore a field jacket over a plain shirt, no jewelry, the unadorned precision of a woman who had spent her adult life being underestimated and had learned to use it. As a special agent assigned to the Bureau's resident agency covering the Western District, she was the sort of person trained to walk into a room and catalog its exits before she shook a single hand. But she had not come to Larkspur to work, not really. She had come to breathe. The reassignment had been her own request, dressed up in the language of administrative necessity, a backlog of dormant case files in a rural satellite office. Somebody needed to clear them, she had volunteered. The truth lived underneath that, and the truth was heavier. 4 months ago, a hostage situation in the city had gone wrong in a way she still replayed in the dark, frame by frame, hunting for the decision she should have made a half-second sooner. No one had blamed her. That was almost worse. She had wanted to come somewhere the air didn't taste like the inside of an interrogation room, somewhere close to the country where she'd grown up, where the only thing watching her was the sky. In the back seat, the dog had not made a sound for 40 miles. Then the brakes of a logging truck shrieked somewhere ahead, a long metal scream that tore the morning open, and the dog came off the seat in a single silent surge, ears pinned, every muscle a drawn bowstring, staring not at the truck but at the black wall of pine to the west. At nothing. At something. The car drifted. Maren's hands corrected on the wheel before her mind caught up, her heart slamming once against her ribs. And then the road was empty again. The truck gone around the bend, the silence rushing back in like water. The dog held that posture for 3 more seconds, trembling, fixed on the tree line. Then he folded himself back down, slow and wary, and would not meet her eyes in the mirror. His name was Coda, and Maren still wasn't sure he had agreed to it. He was a German shepherd, 3.5 years old by the shelter's best guess, with the classic black and tan saddle gone slightly ragged at the edges, and a coat that had only recently regained its shine. She had taken him from a rescue 2 states east, a place that knew nothing of where he had come from. No chip on file then, no history, no name, just a large, beautiful, profoundly distrustful animal who flinched at raised hands and would not eat if a person stood too close to his bowl. The intake notes had used the word reactive. Maren had read between the lines. Somebody, somewhere, had taught this dog that the world was a thing that hurt you. She understood the language of that better than she liked to admit. For 3 weeks they had circled each other in cautious diplomacy, Two creatures who had each decided trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. He slept at the foot of her bed, but never on it. He watched her hands, and just now, on an empty road, he had seen something in the trees that wasn't there, and she had felt, absurdly, that she ought to believe him. Larkspur itself rose out of the valley like a town remembered from a kinder decade. Main Street ran 4 blocks of brick storefronts with hand-painted signs, a hardware store, a diner with steam fogging its windows, planters spilling late marigolds onto the sidewalk. It was a Saturday, and the farmers' market had colonized the square. Canvas awnings, crates of squash and apples, a fiddle player tuning up near the war memorial. People moved with the unhurried ease of those who knew their neighbors' names and their neighbors' griefs. A woman waved at Maren's unfamiliar car simply because waving was the custom. After 18 months of a city that looked through you, the warmth of it landed almost like an ache. She had one stop to make before the rented house, before the boxes and the silence. She turned off Main and climbed the hill toward a white clapboard home with a wide porch and a flag snapping crisp against the blue. And the moment she saw the figure rising from the porch chair, her chest loosened in a way it hadn't in months. Harlan Voss was the closest thing to a father Maren had left. He was 63 now, broad through the shoulders the way men stay broad when they've spent a lifetime doing real work, with a thick crown of silver hair and a face weathered into deep, kind creases. His eyes were the same pale gray as hers, the family eyes, her father's eyes, and when they found her, they crinkled with a joy that was entirely unguarded. He moved with a slight favoring of his left knee, an old ranch injury he refused to complain about, and his handshake, when he forgot himself and offered it before pulling her into a hug instead, was dry and enormous and certain. Harlan had taken her in at 11, the year her father, his younger brother, a staff sergeant, had been killed overseas, folded into a triangle of flag and handed to a child who didn't understand. He had raised her without a single day's complaint, had taught her to shoot and to drive, and to keep her word, and when she'd told him she was joining the Bureau, he had wept just once and called it the proudest day of his life. In Larkspur, he was a county commissioner and the patron saint of every veteran for 60 miles, the man who ran the Regional Veteran Services Office, who showed up at funerals and got men into hospitals and never once made it about himself. Half the town would have taken a bullet for Harlan Voss. "Look at you," he said, holding her at arm's length on the porch, studying her like a man checking a fence line for damage. "City finally let go of my girl." He glanced past her to the car. "And who's this fella giving me the suspicious eye?" "That's Coda," Maren said. "He gives everybody the suspicious eye. Don't take it personal." Harlan crouched, slow with the bad knee, and held out one weathered hand, low and open, palm up, the way a man does who has known 100 frightened dogs. He didn't coax. He didn't reach. He simply waited. And Coda, who had not willingly approached a single human being in 3 weeks, leaned forward an inch from the open car door and drew one long breath of the old man's scent, then drew back, uncertain, a low sound starting and dying in his throat. Harlan murmured, unbothered, rising again. "He'll come round. They always tell you in their own time." He clapped Maren's shoulder. "Come up. I made too much coffee, like always." They sat on the porch as the afternoon tilted gold, and for an hour the weight she'd carried north came off her in pieces. He told her about the market, about the Henderson boy who'd come home from his second tour, about the new program he was getting off the ground to train service dogs for veterans, his eyes shining when he spoke of it, the way they always shone when he talked about taking care of his own. She let herself be a niece and not an agent, let the coffee and the light and the sound of his voice do their patient work. For the first time in a long while, the knot behind her sternum began, tentatively, to loosen. This, she thought, this is why I came. That night, in the half-empty rented house at the edge of the pines, Maren lay awake, listening to a quiet so deep it had texture. She had nearly drifted off when she felt the mattress shift and looked over to find Coda standing rigid at the bedroom window, his black silhouette cut sharp against the moonlight, every line of him pointed toward the tree line. He was not whining. He was not growling. He simply stood, ears forward, utterly still, staring out at the dark wall of forest as though it were speaking to him in a register she could not hear. Maren propped herself on one elbow and followed his gaze into the unbroken black beyond the glass, and saw nothing at all. "Hey," she whispered, "there's nothing out there." But the dog did not move, and did not look at her, and somewhere deep in the animal certainty of him, he had already decided that she was wrong. Morning came to Larkspur in layers, first a gray softening at the windows, then the long gold light spilling over the eastern ridge and setting the lake on fire. Maren had slept badly. Twice in the night she had woken to find Coda still at the window, a black sentinel against the glass, and each time she had told herself it was nothing, a deer, a raccoon, the restlessness of an animal in a new place, and each time she had not quite believed it. By 7 she gave up on sleep entirely, pulled on her running clothes, and clipped the long lead to Coda's collar. If neither of them could rest, they could at least move. There was a fire road that left the edge of her rented property and climbed northwest along the shoulder of the valley, threading between the pines toward the upper reach of Crow Lake. The shelter notes had said the dog needed exercise the way some men needed silence, and so she let him set the pace, the two of them moving through bars of light and shadow while the forest woke around them, jays scolding overhead, the air resinous and cold, dew burning off the ferns. For the first mile, Coda trotted with his usual wary economy, checking back at her now and then as if confirming she hadn't vanished. It was the most ordinary they had ever been together, and Maren felt something in her shoulders unclench. Maybe Harlan was right. Maybe the dog just needed time. Maybe she did too. Then Coda stopped as if he'd struck a wall of glass, every muscle locked, head low, a single thread of sound rising from deep in his chest, and his nose came up to drink the air in 3 sharp pulls, reading something on the wind that turned him from a wary animal into a purposeful one in the space of a heartbeat. The lead went taut. The hair along his spine lifted in a ridge. He was not afraid. That was the thing that stopped Maren's breath. She had spent 3 weeks learning his fear, and this was its opposite. This was recognition. And before she could speak his name, he lunged off the road into the brush, dragging her, stumbling after him, through a stand of young aspen, toward the still water and whatever it was that smelled, to him, like something he had been waiting for. She smelled it a half-second before she saw it, iron and cold earth and something sweetly wrong, and then the aspens opened onto a gravel turnout by the water's edge, and a man was lying in the weeds. He lay on his side near the lake's lip, one arm flung out, and even from 10 feet away, Maren's training catalogued the scene in cold fragments. A man down, breathing shallow, the slack stillness of someone who had been conscious and was no longer choosing to be. His spirit seemed to be ebbing out of him into the ground, his face gray beneath a few days' dark stubble, his lips moving on breath that made no words. She was on her knees beside him before she'd decided to move, 2 fingers at his throat, a pulse, thready but there, and Coda, impossibly, was not barking. The dog had gone silent and low, pressing the whole length of his body against the stranger's back, his muzzle laid alongside the man's jaw, a sound coming out of him that Maren had never heard from any animal. Not a whine, not a growl, but a long, soft, grieving exhalation, as if he had found something he had lost. The man was big, even folded into the dirt, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the dense, functional muscle of someone who used his body for a living. 40, maybe a hard 38. His hair was dark and cut short, his jaw squared and stubbled, his hands scarred across the knuckles in the particular way of men who worked with metal and engines. There was old ink on one forearm, faded blue-green, the edge of a design she couldn't read. His face, even slack and emptied, held something braced into it, a kind of permanent guardedness that even unconsciousness couldn't smooth away. And under that, beneath the gray and the stubble, she could see he had been hurt, not in a fall, not by accident. The careful, deliberate kind. Someone had wanted to teach him something and had been disciplined about it. Maren had her phone out and was reading coordinates to a dispatcher in a flat, fast voice that surprised her with how quickly the agent in her returned. And the whole time Coda did not move from the stranger's side, and the stranger, somewhere far down in himself, turned his face a fraction toward the dog's warmth, as if he knew it. The county ambulance took 40 minutes to find the turnout. Maren rode the fire road back out to flag it down, and even then Coda would not leave the man. She'd had to half-carry him, and he'd strained the whole way back, looking over his shoulder at the figure in the weeds. It was the first time the dog had ever fought to stay close to a human being. She filed that away, beside everything else she didn't understand yet. The regional hospital was 20 minutes south in the next town, a low brick building that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Maren had no business being there. The man was a stranger, she was on personal leave, and there was nothing in her remit that touched a beating by a lake. She told herself she was leaving the second they confirmed he'd live. She did not leave. She sat in a plastic chair in the corridor while a doctor moved in and out, and she watched, through the gap in the curtain, the slow return of a man to himself. When he woke all at once, the way soldiers do, eyes open, body still, taking inventory before he let anyone see he was awake. Maren had seen it before. She stepped to the curtain. "You're at Glenwood County," she said quietly. "You're safe. I found you out by the lake." His eyes found her, dark and flat and entirely without gratitude, and moved past her to the door, the window, the exits. Cataloging, same as she would have. "I'm Maren," she said. "What's your name?" A long silence. Then, in a voice rusted and low, "Wade?" Nothing more. She asked him who had hurt him. He looked at the ceiling. She asked if he wanted her to call the sheriff, and something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, but calculation, swift and cold. And he said, "No," with a finality that closed the subject like a door. She asked where he lived, and after a moment, he said he kept a garage on the South Road, that he fixed engines, that he'd be fine, that she could go. Every sentence was a wall. He would not name a soul. He would not file a report. A man left for half dead by the water, and his single, immovable instinct was to make sure no one looked too closely at why. Maren had interviewed enough people to know what it looked like when someone was protecting something. The only question was whether Wade was protecting himself or protecting something worth more to him than his own safety. It was while the nurse was settling him that Maren noticed it. A small notebook, mud-stained and swollen with damp, that had slid half out of the inner pocket of the jacket they'd cut away from him and dropped onto the chair by the wall. She wasn't proud of what she did next. She told herself she only meant to find an emergency contact. She picked it up and let it fall open, and the damp pages were dense with a tight, disciplined hand, dates, dollar figures, names she didn't know, and stamped across the top of one page, underlined twice, was a name that meant nothing to her yet and would soon mean everything. North Star K 9 Foundation. Beneath it, in the same cramped script, training enrollment $6,500 to $12,000. Veterans only. And a column of question marks beside a list of names, growing more emphatic down the page as if the writer had been asking the dark a question no one would answer. Maren closed the notebook. She should have handed it to him. She should have walked out to her car, driven home, and let the man and his secrets stay by the lake where she'd found them. Instead, the old familiar heat was rising in her, the thing that had made her good at the job and bad at peace. The refusal to let a loose thread lie. Just a name, just one search. She owed it to no one, least of all herself, and she did it anyway, sitting in the hospital parking lot with the laptop balanced on her knees and the afternoon light flat on the screen. North Star K9 Foundation had a clean, handsome website, soft focus photos of German Shepherds and Labradors, of men in flannel kneeling beside attentive dogs, of the words "Healing Through Service" laid over a Montana sunrise. A program to train working and therapy dogs for veterans, funded in part through GI Bill benefits and the generosity of our community partners. It looked, Maren thought, exactly like the kind of thing Harlan would have loved. And then she scrolled to the bottom of the donors page, to the row of smiling photographs beneath the heading, "Our Founding Patrons." And the breath went out of her. There was her uncle, Harlan Voss, broad and silver and beaming, one weathered hand on the shoulder of a tall, polished man in an expensive jacket she didn't recognize, the caption naming the stranger as Dean Holloway, founder. Harlan, who only yesterday had spoken with shining eyes about a new program to train service dogs for veterans. Maren sat very still in the parking lot, the cold running down her spine one vertebra at a time, and behind her in the back seat, Coda lifted his head and watched the tree line, and did not look away. Maren did not sleep on the photograph. She lay awake with it burning behind her eyes, Harlan's broad hand on Dean Holloway's shoulder, the both of them smiling into a Montana sunrise that promised healing through service, and told herself a dozen reasonable things. That her uncle lent his name to half the charities in the county, that a founding patron was a figurehead, a handshake, a check, nothing more. That the dread coiling in her stomach was the reflex of a woman who had spent too long teaching herself to suspect everyone, and had simply forgotten how to stop. None of it touched the cold thing the notebook had put in her. By morning, she had made a decision she knew better than to make. She was going to find Wade Mercer, and she was going to make him talk. The garage sat at the end of the south road where the pavement gave out, a low cinder-block building with a corrugated roof and two bay doors standing open to the morning. A hand-lettered sign read, "Mercer Repair." The yard was orderly in the particular way of a man who could not abide disorder. Tools racked, parts sorted, an old pickup up on jacks with its guts laid open and clean. Wade was under it when she pulled in, and he slid out on a creeper at the sound of tires, rising stiff and slow, one hand pressed briefly to his ribs before he caught himself and let it drop. The bruising along his jaw had darkened to the color of a storm. He looked at her car, then at the dog, rising alert in the back seat, and his guarded face did something complicated. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was closer to a warning given for her sake than his. Maren let Coda out, and the thing that happened then undid both of them a little. The dog crossed the gravel not warily, not in the crouched diplomacy he gave everyone else, but at a trot, tail low and swinging, and pressed his whole head into Wade's scarred hands as if he had been doing it his whole life. Wade went still. Something broke open in his face, just for a second, just at the eyes, and his hand settled on the dog's skull with a gentleness that didn't match the rest of him. "Hey," he said quietly, to the dog, not to her. "Hey, where'd you come from?" And Coda leaned into him and sighed, and Maren understood that whatever wall Wade Mercer had built around himself, this animal had simply walked through it, the way he had walked through hers. "He found you," Maren said. "By the lake. Wouldn't leave you. He's never done that for anyone." She paused. "Including me." Wade crouched, slow with his ribs, and ran his hands down the dog's flanks, the way a man checks an animal he knows how to read. His thumb found the soft fur of one ear and turned it gently, and he went still again. "Maren," he said, her name, the first time he'd used it. "Come look at this." Tattooed on the inside of Coda's ear, faded but legible, was a string of letters and numbers. Wade's voice had gone flat and careful. "That's a kennel ident. Military and contract working dog programs tattoo them. This dog came out of a working program." He looked up at her. "Where did you get him?" "A rescue, 2 states east, no history, no chip on file." She crouched beside him, her pulse picking up. Why? Wade was quiet a long moment, and she watched him decide something, watched the calculation she'd seen in the hospital run behind his eyes and come out the other side. "Because I've seen that tattoo format before," he said. "On a list, in a notebook you've probably already read." He didn't make it an accusation. "You found my book, so you know the name. Sit down, Agent Voss. I'll tell you, because that dog trusts you and he doesn't trust anybody, and I've learned to take his word over mine." He'd known what she was then. He'd clocked her the way she'd clocked him. What he told her, sitting on an upturned crate in the shade of the bay door while Coda lay across his boots, rearranged everything. Wade Mercer had served 12 years, the last 6 of them with a Naval Special Warfare Unit. He said it the way men say things they've decided to stop hiding, plainly, without weight. And in that life, he had worked alongside military canine handlers and knew in his bones what a real working dog program looked like. The cost of it, the rigor, the months, the paper. A year ago, a man he'd served with had come to Larkspur to be near it. Danny Reyes, Wade said, and the name cost him something. Danny had come home from the war with the parts of himself that didn't show all broken, and North Star had promised him the one thing that might put them back: a trained service dog, paid for through his GI benefits, healing through service, just like the Sunrise said. Danny had handed over the better part of $9,000. What he got back was a frightened, sick, half-trained animal that bit at shadows, and a binder of certificates, and a trainer's name on the paperwork. Danny had spiraled, and one gray morning Danny was gone, and Wade had driven north to bury a friend and stayed to understand why. A wrench slipped from the bench and hit the concrete with a flat, ringing clang that bounced off the cinder-block walls, and Wade flinched, a full-body recoil, instant and involuntary, his hand snapping halfway to a weapon that wasn't there. And then he froze, caught in it, his breath gone shallow, and his eyes somewhere 1,000 miles south of Montana. For 3 long seconds, the man who had said 12 years like it was nothing was not in the garage at all. Coda was up before Maren could move, pressing into Wade's chest, grounding him with the dumb, sure weight of his body, and slowly, slowly, Wade came back, one hand fisting in the dog's fur, his jaw working, the storm behind his eyes receding by inches. "Sorry," he said roughly. "To no one. Sorry. Loud noises." And Maren, who had her own frames that played in the dark, said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that the dog wasn't already saying better. When he could, he went on, and the investigator in Maren took over the listening. He had started pulling the thread quietly, he said, because the moment anyone official looked, the people running North Star would scatter, and the paper would burn. He'd photographed enrollment records, copied benefit disbursement forms, written down every name. And the names didn't survive contact. The lead trainer listed on Danny's certificate, a decorated K-9 instructor, the website said, did not exist. No such person held the credential the documents claimed, and the certifying body printed on the seal had no record of the program at all. The kennel was billed for 40 dogs in training. Wade had counted from the tree line 11. The math, over and over, refused to close. It was a machine for turning veterans' benefits into money, dressed in the one costume no one in Larkspur would ever think to search, a charity that helped soldiers. "And the notebook in the hospital," Maren said. "You let them take you down, and you kept that on you. That was careless." Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of Wade's battered mouth. "That book's a decoy. Half of it's chicken scratch. They beat me up by the lake to make a point, and to get back what I had on me, and they got a wet notebook full of dead ends." He nodded toward the garage, toward something she couldn't see. "The real files somewhere they'll never look. Photographs, the disbursement forms, all of it. I took the beating because the second I fight back, I'm not a nosy mechanic anymore. I'm a problem they have to solve permanently. As long as I'm nobody, they think they're safe." He looked down at Coda. "And now you've handed me a witness with 4 legs. That tattoo ties your dog to their kennel. He's not a coincidence, Agent Voss. He's evidence." It took Maren the rest of the day and a borrowed scanner at the Larkspur Library to run it down. But Wade was right. The ident tattooed in Coda's ear matched an entry on one of Wade's photographed intake lists, a dog logged into the North Star program 18 months ago and written off the books 4 months later as washed out, rehomed out of state. Rehomed. The frightened animal she had pulled out of a shelter 2 states east, the one who flinched at hands and would not eat with a person near, had not come from nowhere. He had come from them. The dog had been trying to lead her back to the place that broke him since the moment she'd crossed into the valley. She should have stopped there. She had enough to make a phone call. Instead, she did the last thing, the thing she'd been circling since the parking lot, because she could not know. She pulled the public county filings for North Star's grant approvals, the ones that moved real money through real desks. And there, on the Regional Veterans Services Authorization that had unlocked the program's access to benefit funds, scanned and stamped and dated, was a signature she had known her whole life, the broad, certain, unmistakable hand of Harlan Voss. Maren sat in the empty library with the screen glowing on her face, and beside her Coda lifted his head and looked toward the door, and she felt the floor of her childhood tilt and begin, very quietly, to give way. The drive to the field office in the city took 5 hours, and Maren made it on no sleep and too much coffee, the photographs and filings copied onto a drive in her jacket pocket like something that might burn through the fabric. She had spent the night talking herself out of a dozen kinder explanations and failing each time. By the time she pulled into the federal lot, she had arrived at the only thing an investigator could do with a thread this size: hand it to someone with the authority to pull it. She told herself that was why she'd come. She did not yet let herself think about whose name was at the end of the thread. Her supervisor was a man named Curtis Pruitt, the supervisory special agent who'd signed off on her transfer, 50-some years old and built like a filing cabinet, gray at the temples, with the flat, unhurried patience of a man 3 years from his pension who had learned exactly how much trouble was worth taking on. He was not unkind. That was almost the problem. He listened to all of it: the beaten mechanic, the notebook, the non-existent trainer, the certifying body with no record, 40 dogs billed and 11 counted, the tattooed dog tying it all to the kennel. And he turned his coffee cup a slow quarter turn on the desk and said the things she'd known he would say. That it was thin, that a disgruntled vet and a rescue dog and a county charity weren't a federal case, they were a hunch. That GI Bill fraud lived with the VA's Inspector General until it didn't. That benefit disbursement was a thicket of jurisdiction, that she was on personal leave and had no business running a source out of a lakeside town. "Bring me something hard," Pruitt said, not unsympathetically. "Bring me money moving where it shouldn't. Then I can open a file." She'd half expected that. What she hadn't expected was the phone. It rang on Pruitt's desk, a single electronic chirp, sharp in the closed office, and he glanced at the screen, and his whole posture changed, the easy slouch going straight, the hand finding the receiver before the second ring, and he said, "Yes, sir," and then said almost nothing else, just listened, his eyes drifting up once to Maren's face and away, and in the silver light of that little screen she watched something close over her supervisor, like a door swinging shut. When he set the phone down, the temperature in the room had changed. He did not tell her who it was. He didn't have to. Someone, somewhere above this office, had heard the name North Star before she'd finished saying it. Someone with enough weight to make a careful man more careful. And the thread she'd driven 5 hours to hand over had just been quietly, firmly taken out of her hands. "Voss," Pruitt said, and his voice had gone formal in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "Is there anyone connected to this matter you have a personal relationship with?" The question hung there. She could have lied. The reflex rose and she put it down, because she was, underneath everything, her father's daughter and Harlan's, and they had both taught her the same unbending thing. "Yes," she said, The grant authorizations were signed by Maren Voss, the Regional Veterans Services Director. A beat. He's my uncle. He raised me. She watched the case leave her in real time. Pruitt's face did something almost gentle, and that was the worst of it. There was a conflict of interest a mile wide, he said. She was now a potential witness, possibly a source, but she could not be an investigating agent on a matter touching her own family. It would poison anything they built, hand a defense attorney the keys. He would refer it. He would loop in the Bureau's financial crimes people and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, who lived for exactly this kind of paper, and they would do it right, by the book, at the speed the book demanded. And she would step back. She would not contact Holloway, would not run her mechanic, would not so much as drive past the kennel. "I know," Pruitt said, reading her face, "that this is the worst possible thing to ask of you. That's why I'm asking it." He meant it as mercy. It landed like a cell door. She had found the rot at the heart of her own town, and the system she'd given her life to had just with perfect procedural compassion tied her hands and told her to wait. She drove the 5 hours back north in the dark and arrived at Wade's garage near midnight because she did not know where else to put herself. He was awake. She suspected he was always awake, and he read the wreck of her in the headlights and didn't ask. He just set a second mug on the workbench and poured from a battered percolator and let her sit. Coda came and put his head in her lap and stayed there, a warm anchor against the spinning, and for a while none of them said anything. Then, in the low yellow light of the single bulb over the bay, with the night pressing cold against the open door, the two of them did the thing neither had done with anyone in a long time. Wade told her about the dreams, not the war itself, he never named that, but the after of it, the way a dropped wrench could put him back in a place he'd spent years climbing out of, the friends who hadn't climbed out at all, Danny the last of them. And Maren told him about the city, the hostage room, the half-second she still hunted in the dark, the man she hadn't saved. She told him about her father, the folded flag, the 11-year-old who'd been handed a triangle of cloth and a new life under Harlan's roof. She had never said most of it out loud. The dog lay between them on the cold concrete, shifting his weight to keep some part of himself touching each of them, and Maren understood that this, two broken people and the animal stitching them together, was the only honest thing that had happened to her in months. It was nearly 2 when the headlights swept the yard. They came without hurry, a big crew cab truck rolling to a stop just inside the gravel, and 2 men climbed out into the spill of the garage light. The one who did the talking was lean and unhurried, with a rancher's tan and a flat, affable smile that never reached his eyes. The kind of man hired precisely because he could deliver a threat like a weather report. He said they'd heard Wade had been asking questions that weren't his to ask. He said Larkspur was a small town, and small towns took care of loose ends. He said it pleasantly the whole time, while the second man drifted wide along the edge of the light. Wade stood easy, hands loose, playing the part he'd bled to keep, just a mechanic, just a nobody, no threat worth finishing. And Maren saw the cost of that restraint in the cords of his neck. The lean man took a step closer, still smiling, and reached out to put a hand on Wade's chest, the way you shove a thing to see if it'll fall. He never landed it. Coda came off the concrete in a black blur and put himself between them, low and broad and silent, lips off his teeth, every ounce of the working dog they'd tried to break standing planted in the gravel with his hackles up, and a sound rolling out of him that stopped both men cold. It was not the frantic warning of a pet. It was the still certain promise of an animal who had decided exactly how far this was going to go. The lean man's smile finally faltered. He looked at the dog and at Maren, who had risen with the unthinking authority of someone whose hand rests near a badge, even off duty, and he recalculated, the way men like him always do, and stepped back with his palms raised and that easy smile sliding back into place. "Didn't know you had company," he said to Wade. "We'll talk another time." They were gone as unhurried as they'd come, and the night closed over the sound of the truck, and Coda did not stand down until the taillights had vanished entirely. Wade let out a breath he'd been holding for a year. He crouched and took the dog's head in both hands and pressed his forehead to it. "Okay," he said low. "Okay, I hear you." And Maren, watching, felt the last of her caution burn off. They could take the case away from her. They could not take this. She didn't sleep that night either, but for once it wasn't the city playing behind her eyes. She sat at Wade's workbench with the laptop and did the one thing Pruitt couldn't stop her from doing because it was all public record. She followed the money the only way she could from the outside, through the open filings, the incorporation papers, the charitable disclosures that anyone could pull. North Star's funding didn't simply sit in North Star. It moved out through a management company, through a consulting entity with no employees and a post office box for an address. And then, when she finally chased it to ground at the bottom of a county nonprofit registry, as the gray light came up over Crow Lake, into something called the Voss Veterans Memorial Trust. A fund built, the filing said, to honor the fallen. A fund controlled, the filing said, by a single signatory. Maren read the name she already knew she'd find, and set her forehead against the cold edge of the workbench, and let herself, for 1 minute, be a niece losing her uncle before she stood back up and went on being what her father had made her. The federal team arrived in Larkspur on a Tuesday, and they arrived the way the Bureau does when paper has finally outweighed politics. Quietly, without sirens, 2 unremarkable sedans, and a forensic accountant who looked more dangerous than either of the agents. Her name was Renata Cho, and she was small and precise and somewhere in her 40s, with black hair cut blunt at the jaw and reading glasses pushed up into it, dressed like a woman who had stopped caring what a courtroom thought of her shoes because her spreadsheets always won. She had spent 20 years at IRS criminal investigation, taking apart men who believed they were too clever to be counted. And she spoke about money the way a surgeon speaks about a body, with a calm, total intimacy that left no room for sentiment. Maren, formally recused and reduced to a witness, was permitted into the room only because the trail ran through a dog asleep at her feet and a mechanic who would speak to no one else. It took Cho 4 days to build what Wade had spent a year only glimpsing. The first layer fell fast. North Star K-9 Foundation was a shell with a sunrise painted on it. Dean Holloway, the polished founder from the website, who turned out in person to be a soft-handed man in his 50s with a salon tan, capped teeth, and the restless eyes of someone always counting the exits, had no background in working dogs, no credential, no history of training anything but investors. The program was theater. The 11 dogs Wade had counted were props maintained just well enough to photograph. Everything else was invoice. The second layer was the one that turned a fraud into a crime that put men in prison for a decade. Cho laid it out on Wade's workbench, of all places, because Maren's rented house felt watched, and the field office was 5 hours south, pulled disbursement records beside Holloway's own filed returns, and let the numbers do the indicting. She tapped one figure on the page, a single underlined line, and the garage went so quiet that Maren could hear the tick of the cooling percolator and the slow drag of Coda's breathing against the concrete, and for a long suspended second no one moved, because the number Cho's finger rested on was so small beside the rivers of money above it that it could only mean one thing. He reported income of a few $1,000s, Cho said, without inflection, into that silence. For a man through whose accounts the better part of $1 million has passed in 3 years. She let it sit. You don't underreport like this by accident. You do it because the money was never supposed to be yours on paper. It was only ever passing through. The smoking gun wasn't a confession or a witness. It was arithmetic. Holloway had skimmed veterans' benefits at the front door and washed them out the back, and the gap between what he earned and what he touched was a confession written in a language he'd been too greedy to keep clean. But Holloway was the mouth, not the hand. And it was the third layer that Maren had been bracing for since the parking lot, and still was not ready to survive. The consulting entity, the management company, the dead-end post office box, they were knots, and Cho untied them one by one until the rope ran, where Maren already knew it ran, into the Voss Veterans Memorial Trust. Holloway moved the money. Harlan structured it. The trust was the genius of the thing and the horror of it. A real charity with real good works stapled to its front. Scholarships for the children of the fallen, a wing of the county hospital, a stone memorial in the square that half of Larkspur had wept in front of on Memorial Day. Harlan Voss had built a laundry that no one would ever audit, because auditing it felt like spitting on a grave. He had taken the grief of an entire region, the grief he had carried himself, the grief that had made him take in an orphaned 11-year-old girl, and he had used it as a cover. He was stealing from veterans in the name of honoring veterans. He was robbing the exact community that had buried Maren's father, and he had been doing it with the same hands that taught her to keep her word. Cho watched Maren's face with a clinical gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said, and seemed to mean it in her bloodless way. "It's almost always someone's good man. That's why it works." Maren walked out of the garage into the cold afternoon and stood at the edge of the gravel where the pines came down to meet the yard, and she shook, not with cold. Everything she was had been built on Harlan's roof. Her sense of right, her straight back, the badge she'd half-killed herself to earn. He had given her all of it, and all of it was now a knife pointed at his throat, and she was the one holding it. She thought she might come apart. And then there was a weight against her leg, warm and insistent, and she looked down to find Coda leaning the full of himself into her, his amber eyes turned up to her face, and she remembered what Wade had said the first day, that he took the dog's word over his own. The dog had pulled her off a road to a dying man. The dog had walked through every wall. The dog had known, from the first restless night at the window, that there was something in these woods worth refusing to look away from. She knelt and put her arms around his neck and breathed him in, and the spinning slowed, and when she stood up, she was, again, her father's daughter. It was that evening that everything that had been moving slowly began to move at once. Holloway, it turned out, had a man inside the field office's orbit. The unexplained call to Pruitt had been only the first tremor, and the moment the federal accountants started pulling trust records, word ran back up the rope. They could not reach Harlan. He had lawyers and a reputation and time, but they could reach the loose mechanic and the recused agent at the end of the South Road, the two people who'd started the avalanche, and they came at full dark to do it. Not two men this time. Four, and the crew cab, and the lean, smiling one from before, with the smile finally gone. They came to take the evidence and erase the inconvenience, and they came believing they were dealing with a backwoods grease monkey and a woman they'd been told was off the case. They had never been more wrong about anyone. What happened in the next 90 seconds, Maren would never fully be able to describe to the investigators because it happened faster than description. The first man through the bay door reached for her, and Wade Mercer stopped being a mechanic. There was no rage in it, which was the frightening part, only a terrible economy, a man moving through a problem he had been trained for in 100 worse places than this, disarming and folding and putting down 3 men with the spare, unhurried competence of someone for whom violence had once been a profession and was now only a memory he'd hoped never to need again. Coda took the fourth, driving him back against the truck and pinning him there with that same low, certain promise. And in the sudden ringing stillness afterward, with 4 men groaning on the gravel and the night air sharp with the smell of cold steel and pine, the lean man stared up at Wade from the ground and finally understood what he'd been beaten unconscious by the lake for failing to recognize. "You're not a mechanic," he said. "No," Wade agreed, and there was no triumph in it, only a deep and ancient tiredness, the cover of a year and the cover of a life both gone at once. "I'm not." Maren had her phone out before the last man hit the ground, and her voice, when it came, was level and clear and entirely the agent's again. She could not investigate her uncle. She had been told that, and she had obeyed it, and standing in the wreckage of Holloway's last mistake, she understood at last that obeying it had never meant going quiet. She gave the dispatcher the address and the count and the name she had and told them to send everyone, and then she made the second call, the one to Renata Cho, and she did the only thing left to a recused agent who held in her hands the whole of the truth. She handed it over. All of it. The drive, the filings, the dogs, the trust, the name she had loved her entire life. "It's clean," she told Cho. "Chain of custody, all of it. Take it and finish it." Her voice did not shake. Behind her, Wade crouched in the gravel with one hand on Koda's heaving side, and the two of them, the soldier and the dog who had both been broken by the same kind of men and refused, in the end, to stay broken, watched her stand in the garage light and choose, with her eyes open, the harder of the only two roads she had left. They could not arrest Harlan Voss quietly. A man who had spent 30 years becoming the conscience of a county does not fall without the whole county feeling the ground move. And so the federal team did it the careful way. Warrant signed, the trust frozen, Holloway already in custody, and with his exits finally counted and found wanting, talking fast enough to bury everyone above him. The call that had once made Pruitt go straight in his chair turned out to be nothing more sinister than an old man phoning an older friend, a favor between men who'd shaken hands at 100 ribbon cuttings. It had bought Harlan a week, no more. Influence is only weather. Arithmetic is climate. And Renata Cho's spreadsheets did not care whose grave the money hid behind. Maren asked for one thing, and because she was recused and had earned it, and because Cho understood something about endings, they let her have it. Not to make the arrest, only to be in the room first. She found him on his porch in the early light, in the same chair he'd risen from to hold her at arm's length a lifetime ago, and Harlan Voss did not look surprised to see her. He looked older. The broad shoulders had come down, the silver head bent over hands that turned a coffee cup in slow circles, and the pale gray family eyes that found hers held no defiance, only a deep and weary sorrow that was almost worse than guilt. "You found it," he said. "It wasn't a question. I found it." She stayed on the steps, the morning cold between them. "Tell me why." And he tried. That was the thing that would stay with her, not that he denied it, but that he believed in some ruined chamber of himself that it could be explained. He told her about the years after her father, the ranch failing, the cost of raising a grieving child on a public servant's salary, the first small mercy of moving money that wasn't quite his, and the way the first time makes the second easy and the 100th invisible. He told her the good works were real, the scholarships, the hospital wing, the stone in the square, as if a true thing built on a stolen one could launder the soul the way it laundered the cash. "I did it for you," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "Everything. I gave you a life. I gave this whole town. You stole from them." Her voice did not rise. "From men like my father. You used the people we buried as a wall to hide behind." She watched the defense go out of him, watched the practiced certainty of 30 years collapse into the small, frightened thing underneath. "Dad kept his word when it cost him everything. You taught me that, and you didn't keep yours." The screen door behind him swung on its hinge with a long, thin creak and clapped shut in the breeze, and at the sound Harlan flinched and turned toward the house, toward the rooms where he'd raised her, the kitchen, the worn place on the stair. And for one suspended moment the old man looked at his own home as a stranger looks at a thing already lost, and his face simply broke, all of it at once, 30 years of careful goodness caving into a grief he could not perform his way out of. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and for the first time it was not an argument. It was the truth, arriving far too late to matter. "Maren, I'm sorry." When the agents came up the walk a few minutes later, he stood without being asked and put his hands out and did not look away from her, and she made herself watch, because he had taught her that too, that you do not flinch from the things you set in motion. The kennel they hit the same morning, and that was where the grief turned at last toward something that could heal. The North Star compound sat behind a locked gate up a logging road, and when the federal team cut the chain and the doors came open, Maren went in with them as a witness and came out changed. There were 19 dogs in those runs, not the 11 Wade had counted from the tree line, more hidden in the back, and they were not abused so much as forgotten, kept just alive enough to photograph and then left in the dark when the cameras stopped. They came to the front of their kennels slowly, these animals, with the careful hope of creatures who had learned that hope was usually a trick. Maren crouched at the gate of a thin shepherd mix with a graying muzzle and dull, downcast eyes, and she spoke to it low the way Harlan had once shown her, palm open, asking nothing. And she watched the moment the animal decided to believe her, watched the soulful eyes lift and clear and find her face, the weakened spirit gathering itself back toward the light. And she understood that this was the work, the only work that had ever mattered. Every one of those dogs found a home. The county made sure of it. The town that had wept at Harlan's stone memorial showed up with leashes and blankets and open doors, as if to prove that the goodness he'd counterfeited had been real in them all along. The rest came in the slow grind of the law, the way real justice does, no thunderclap, only the patient closing of a file. Holloway pled and named names and went away for years. The Voss Veterans Memorial Trust was dissolved, its stolen benefits clawed back and returned to the veterans North Star had robbed, dollar by dollar. And out of the wreckage, because Larkspur was the kind of place that rebuilt, a new program rose on the ashes of the old one. A real one this time, with real trainers and real dogs and no sunrise slogan over the door. Run quietly out of a county grant, the first graduate of which was a frightened black and tan shepherd who had once been written off the books as washed out, rehomed out of state. Coda passed his certification on a bright cold morning in November. Maren stood at the edge of the field and watched the dog who had refused to leave a dying man by a lake, who had walked through every wall she owned, take the last obstacle clean and turn to find her face in the small crowd. And she did not bother to hide that she was crying. He was hers now, formally, on paper, K-9 Coda, Special Agent Voss's partner. But the paper only said what the road had already decided the night he came off the seat, staring into trees that held a secret neither of them could yet see. Wade closed the garage for an afternoon that spring and drove them up to a quiet rise above Crow Lake, and there, with his scarred hands and no ceremony, he set a small flat stone into the earth where the water caught the light. No name carved deep, just initials and a date and a thing only he and the dead man would understand. He had stopped being a nobody. The town knew now what he'd been, and instead of fear, it had given him a strange, gentle respect, and he wore it uneasily, but he wore it. He'd have liked it here, Wade said, of Danny, looking out over the water, and Maren stood beside him and let the silence be enough. She visited her father's grave on her way out of town that week, though she wasn't leaving anymore. She'd put in the transfer to stay, the resident agency glad to have her. She told him the part he'd want to know, that his brother had done a terrible thing, and that she had not looked away, and that it had cost her, and she had paid it. She thought he would have understood the cost. She thought, standing there in the wind off the mountains, that she had finally stopped hunting the half-second in the dark because somewhere along this road she had stopped being the woman who lost the man in the city and become again simply her father's daughter, which had always been enough. What grew between her and Wade grew the way everything real had on this trip north, slowly and without announcement, two people who had each been broken by the same kind of men and had each, with the dog's patient help, refused to stay that way. Neither of them named it. There was time. There was, finally, time. On the last bright morning before the snow came down for good, Maren let Coda off the lead in the meadow that ran down to the water, and the shepherd, 3.5 years old, whole now, his coat gone glossy and his eyes clear, ran flat out through the frost-burned grass with his ears flying and the lake throwing the sun-back gold around him, running for the sheer animal joy of a world that had finally, against all odds, turned out to be safe. Maren watched him go and felt the last cold thing inside her let go and lift away on the wind, and she thought that sometimes fate arrives on four legs, on a dark road, and stops, and refuses to move, and looks straight into the place a person cannot yet see, and waits for them to follow. If this story moved you, take a moment with what it leaves behind. Maren Voss came to Larkspur with nothing but her wounds and a frightened dog who would not trust her. She did not find healing because she went looking for it. She found it because a creature with no words refused to leave a dying man by the side of a road, and because she chose to follow where that loyalty led, even when the trail ran straight through her own heart. That is the quiet truth at the center of this story. The people who hurt us are sometimes the ones we loved most, and the courage to face the truth costs us dearly. But truth, faced honestly, sets us free. There is a lesson here that reaches far beyond a small town in Montana. The world is full of beautiful words painted over ugly things, charities that steal, smiles that hide knives, good men who quietly lose their way, one small compromise at a time. Harlan Voss did not become what he became in a single day. None of us do. We become who we are in the small choices, the first time we tell ourselves that this once will not matter. So guard your heart in the little things, keep your word when it costs you, and never let the good you do become a mask for the harm you allow. And do not overlook the animals who walk beside us. Coda saw what no human eye could see. He sensed the danger in the trees, the man bleeding by the water, the truth buried beneath a town. Scripture tells us that not even a sparrow falls to the ground without our Father knowing, and perhaps that is why a loyal dog so often feels like a small miracle sent at exactly the right hour. The love of an animal is one of the purest gifts God places in this broken world, asking nothing, giving everything. If there is a creature in your life who trusts you, honor that trust. And if there is one still waiting in a shelter for someone to believe in it, remember that you may be the road it has been waiting on all along. We are all, in our own way, the wounded soldier by the lake and the frightened dog in the back seat. We are all hoping someone will stop and stay and refuse to look away. Be that person today. Be kind to the lonely, gentle with the broken, faithful in the small things. Rescue what you can. Love while you have the time, because time in the end is the one mercy none of us can keep forever. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty, truth, and love still win. Leave a comment and tell us about an animal who changed your life. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story of hope, justice, and second chances. And until we meet again, may God bless you. May He watch over you and the ones you love, and may He send a faithful friend to walk beside you on every dark road ahead.